Now, moving swiftly on, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the Auditor General for Scotland, Caroline Gardner.
Good morning, colleagues. It's my pleasure to be with you here today, so thanks for inviting me. As previous speakers have said, Scotland's colleges clearly are a really vital part of our education and skills system. You provide a vital service to people across Scotland and also help contribute towards sustainable economic growth by helping people build the skills and experience they need to build Scotland's economy and also fulfil their own potential. And we absolutely recognise the importance of that. In 2014-15, just over 220,000 people attended Scotland's colleges to pursue a variety of learning and qualifications. Colleges receive a significant amount of public money to help them fund that work, over £500 million in 2014-15. And as Auditor General, my role is to help the Parliament and the public more widely to understand how that money is being used, where the opportunities are to get more from it, and where the pressure points are in the way that it's currently being spent. We've produced a number of reports over the last few years on Scotland's colleges to help fulfil that role. The starting point is always the audited accounts of Scotland's colleges themselves to provide a picture across the sector of the way that money is being spent. And we add to that with our insights on the bigger picture right across Scotland, from the government strategy to the financial pressures you're all facing, to try and give an overall picture of the sector as a whole and identify where attention needs to be focused for future success to come through. In the past few years, the focus has been very much on the government's reform programme and the way that's been going, the success of the programme and the areas where there have been particular issues that need further attention. The reports have also commented very closely on the financial position, given the financial pressures you're all facing, on governance, as previous speakers have said, and increasingly now on the softer but equally important issues around student participation and outcomes for students. We've been strengthening our engagement with the sector over the last wee while to make sure that our work is really informed by a thorough understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve across Scotland and in your local areas, and that we understand both the challenges you're facing and the things that you're trying in order to meet those challenges. We absolutely recognise that you are the people with the insight into the way this works in practice. We're very committed to continuing to build on that engagement, and we're grateful to all of you who have made time to meet with our audit team to share your experience and make sure that our work is as well informed and constructive as it can be. As you'd expect, there are many views about the reform programme, about governance and the financial pressures that colleges are facing. It's our job to pull together all of the evidence that we have, but those insights are very important to us. Today, I'd like to focus briefly on the most recent report that we published in August of this year on Scotland's colleges, which aims to give an overall picture of where we are now, and particularly with how you're all coping with the impact of the recent reforms. Our overall message is that Scotland's college sector is financially stable and that it's achieving its learning targets while still adjusting to the major changes that you have been through in the way that you all operate. But there are some important issues that remain outstanding and some future pressures on the horizon that you'll need to deal with if the full effects of the reform programme are going to be achieved and addressed by the sector as a whole. It's becoming a cliche this morning to talk about the scale of the changes you're all facing, and I know you'll be more aware of that than I am, but that just gives you a snapshot of some of the things that have been on the agenda for you all over the last 4 or 5 years. I'm not going to go through that in detail, time doesn't allow it. The full report's available on our website if you want to follow it up, but I'd just like to pull out a few key points this morning to focus your discussion later in the day. First of all, funding. The college sector has faced more significant reductions in its funding over the last few years than other sectors, around 27% reduction between 2010-11 and 2014-15. That compares with about 6% for local government funding and less than 1% for NHS funding. Now, it's clearly a policy decision for any government to decide where its funding should be allocated and what it wants to achieve with that. But it's clear that they are significant reductions in funding by any measure, and that the college sector has done well to continue to deliver its learning targets against that background. At the same time, you've been through a very significant process of regionalisation and mergers. Mergers weren't required by the government's reform programme, but many colleges decided to merge in line with the new regional approach the government was setting out, but also to help them to meet those funding pressures that were out there. The creation of 13 college regions led to a reduction in the number of colleges and also to new accountability arrangements for most colleges. The number of incorporated colleges, the ones that fall within my audit responsibilities, fell from 37 to 20. And those 20 colleges are now organised into 13 college regions. 10 of those college regions contain one college, while the remaining 3 are multi-college regions, with a regional strategic body responsible for planning regional delivery. And this map from our report gives you just a sense of the structure as it currently stands. There have also been some big changes in accountability, and I think they're still an area that's very much working through in the reform process. The single college regions are accountable directly to the Funding Council, while colleges in the multi-college regions have a line of accountability to both the Funding Council and to their respective regional strategic body. One of the key messages from my report is that the government is still not able to fully measure and report the benefits and the costs of the regionalisation and merger programme, and therefore how far it goes to helping with the financial pressures that we have seen on the college sector as a whole. The Funding Council estimated that reforms would lead to savings of £50 million by 2015-16. That estimate was based on the reduction in the funding that was being allocated to colleges against a slight increase in the amount of activity that was being delivered. The Funding Council recently published an estimate of the costs of mergers, which contains some very useful examples of the way in which colleges are using the new opportunities to change what they do. But there are some gaps in the analysis, and as we reported last year, and the Funding Council acknowledges in its report, colleges have found it difficult to separate the costs of reform from the costs that have arisen from other changes in the sector. In terms of benefits, the government and the Funding Council have still to set out some of the detailed measures they're planning to use to demonstrate that the benefits they were looking for have been delivered. And some of the measures, such as student destinations and employer engagement, don't have baseline information. Now, I've reported on a range of reform programmes right across government over the last few years, and that's not unique. But I think it is increasingly important that government is very clear not just what benefits it hopes will come through, but how it will measure that. And it's becoming increasingly difficult now to sort of reverse engineer what the baseline might have been to show the benefits that have come from the college reform programme over the last few years. The third financial pressure that's come through, that's still working through the system, has been the reclassification of colleges as public bodies. The Office for National Statistics decided to reclassify colleges as public bodies a couple of years ago, and that means that colleges are now treated as part of central government for financial purposes and operate within the same annual budget control limits as other public bodies. Colleges are now required to comply with the Scottish Public Finance Manual, and this has increased accountability. But from a college perspective, the change has also increased reporting requirements and reduced financial flexibility and autonomy, with no obvious business benefits at a local level. One of the most significant effects of that is that colleges are now required to break even each year without being able to carry forward surpluses as they were able to in the past. They can also no longer use the reserves that have been accumulated in past years to fund current or future spending. To mitigate the effects of this change, colleges worked with the Funding Council to establish independent arm's-length foundations managed by independent trustees. I don't audit those foundations, but they do produce audited annual accounts that are submitted to the charities regulator, Oscar, each year for accountability purposes. In broad terms, what's happened is that colleges transfer to those foundations any surpluses that they generate in a year, with the expectation that when the surplus is needed, the college will be able to apply for and receive the funds back again. Colleges transferred £99 million to those foundations in the first year of their operation, and a further £7 million last year in 2014-15. The foundations therefore hold significant sums of public money that sit outside public sector control. In order to preserve the foundation's independence, there's no guarantee that the funds will be returned to the original college, or indeed to the college sector as a whole. The Funding Council has reported that colleges have secured nearly £20 million of that funding back for their own purposes since they were established. But any organisation that supports further education in Scotland can apply to receive funding from the foundations. So there is another element of uncertainty in your funding as a result of that shift that you're having to deal with. The creation of these foundations is further complicated by the fact that the college financial year end is different from the Scottish Government's financial year end. Colleges prepare their financial statements, as you will know, for the year to the 31st of July, while the Scottish Government's year end is the 31st of March. Now that sounds like just a technical thing, but what it means, and as we were seeing during last year's audits, was that colleges need to decide how much they'll transfer into their foundation before the end of their financial year, indeed before the final quarter of their financial year. If the financial forecasts turn out not to be accurate, that means that colleges can transfer money that leads to them generating a deficit in their own accounts. And indeed, they may need to transfer money and then very shortly afterwards apply for its return with all of the uncertainty associated with that in order to hit their financial targets. And all of that's adding a layer of complexity to what's already a challenging set of financial management issues for you to deal with on a college board. The fourth area I want to focus on this morning is college activity. Changes in the policies of both the government and the Funding Council have altered both the types of students attending colleges and how they are funded. This slide shows the college student numbers and full-time equivalents over the last 10 years very broadly, from 2007 to 2015. In 2015, as I said, more than 200,000 people received education and learning from colleges, and just over 11,700 staff were employed. Our report does highlight that despite the many changes and challenges you've been facing, you've continued to exceed your targets for providing learning, but the nature of the provision has changed significantly over that period. There's been a 14% increase in the number of under 25-year-olds in full-time college education over this 8-year period. Over the same period, the total number of students has decreased by 41%, mainly as a result of a reduction in the number of part-time students. From a peak of 321,000 students at the start of this period, the number of part-time students had fallen by 48% in 2014-15 to 166,000. So a very significant fall there in the number of part-time students affected. There's no way to know, as Alice said, if that change reflects a fall in demand or not, because the information on demand for college places, while it's collected by individual colleges, isn't collated nationally. But I think it's a really key gap that needs to be filled if we're going to understand how well further education is meeting the needs of individuals and communities right across Scotland, and reducing inequalities in the way that the Minister highlighted earlier this morning. Equally important, alongside the number of students receiving learning and education in colleges, is how well they're doing through that learning. Looking at attainment very briefly, the overall percentage of full-time students who successfully completed their courses increased year on year between 2009-10 and 2013-14, from 59% to 66%, but then dropped back slightly to 64% in 2014-15. That picture does vary quite a lot between colleges. The attainment of full-time students fell in 9 colleges between 2013-14 and 14-15 by between 1% and 8%. So in some colleges, quite a marked reduction. I think it's important to say nobody's really clear what's driving that. We know there's no direct link between mergers and attainment. Attainment fell in both merged and unmerged colleges over the period. Colleges told us that the amount of change in the sector was a factor, along with the efforts to widen access to students from more deprived backgrounds. But it's an area where we do need more information, I think, to understand what's driving that fall and what we can do to reverse it back to the previous increasing trend. Information on destinations for college students was published for the first time this year. Obviously a great result to have that information available to help inform decision making. For students who left college in 2013-14, at least 82% went on to education, training or employment, and of them 17% went into employment. For 2014-15, the number going on to positive destinations overall increased slightly to 83%, but the percentage going into employment again fell very slightly from 17% to 14%. And again, I think it's important we understand what that is and what we can do to be reversing it if that's what's needed. This information and the questions that it raises, I think, do raise the broader question about whether the government's and the funding council's focus on full-time courses is having the desired effects, or whether, as Alice has suggested, and I'd strongly support, that wider question of where FE sits in with work-based learning, with schools and with universities, is the area that we need to be exploring for the future to make sure that our overall policy goals are being achieved. We have recommended that the Funding Council should explore with you in colleges how best to assess the demand for college places and that wider raft of education and learning experiences across Scotland, and how the sector as a whole can work together to fill the demand which is available based on the reforms that are now coming together and working their way through. I'll touch briefly on staffing because they're such an important part of your finances as well as your ability to deliver what you're doing. There was a 9% decrease in full-time equivalent staff numbers between 2011-12 and 2013-14, and then again a slight uptick in 2014-15 with staff numbers increasing by 5%. We have engaged as heavily as we can with staff to understand the impact of mergers on them, and as you'd expect, I guess, their feedback is very mixed. Some staff felt that mergers had been very successful and cited benefits including sharing best practice and offering more opportunities for development, both their professional development and their ability to deliver new types of learning, new courses to students across Scotland. But others did have concerns about the impact of voluntary severance on workloads and on the reduced number of support staff in their ability to focus on carrying out their jobs. Pulling all of that together into the financial position of the sector. The financial position of colleges did deteriorate overall in 2014-15. We found from analysing the audited accounts that there was an overall deficit of £28 million, and after technical adjustments, the deficit decreased to about £3 million. That compares to an underlying surplus of about £15 million in the previous year, in 2013-14. It's important, though, I think, that I'm clear that that underlying deficit represents less than 1% of total income. And therefore, I concluded that the overall state of the sector is in relatively good financial health. However, at the time of our audit work, 8 colleges were forecasting a deficit in this financial year, 2015-16, and 11 were forecasting a deficit next year in 16-17. And we identified 4 colleges that are facing very specific financial challenges that will need detailed financial planning to turn around. We know that all colleges are facing further financial pressures, whatever the outcome of the next government's budget is. These include things like the national pay bargaining approach, which is likely to increase pressure on costs in some colleges in particular, estate maintenance and student support funding, as well as changes to the Funding Council's funding model, which is likely over a period of time to increase the pressure on some colleges while easing the pressure on others. However, we found that most colleges don't have long-term financial plans that would help them to understand the pressures that they're facing in sufficient detail to be thinking ahead about the solutions. Now, first of all, colleges aren't alone in that. I've made the same finding about a number of other public bodies, including health boards right across Scotland. And I do know that many public bodies have got concerns about their ability to produce longer-term financial plans when actually your funding allocation generally only covers 1 year at a time. But I do think that particularly in the current financial climate, those excuses, those reasons really don't stand up to scrutiny. I think any public body, particularly in times of financial pressures like the ones we're facing at the moment, really does need to make sure that your executive team are putting in the work to look into a range of scenarios over the next 5 years or so, looking at likely income levels and likely expenditure levels, looking at a range of scenarios for what funding you might get from the Funding Council, for what might come out of national bargaining on terms and conditions for your staff, and other changes that are local and specific to you, and thinking through what different scenarios might look like and what your responses to those scenarios might be. It's absolutely what the auditors that I appoint will be looking for as we head into the years ahead. And much more importantly, I think it helps you to make sure that you understand the financial pressures you're working with and are able to make decisions that are as good and sustainable as they can be. The final point I'd like to touch on this morning is, again, about governance and the role of the Funding Council. Alongside the annual reports that I've referred to here on the college sectors, over the last 3 or 4 years I have prepared a number of reports on individual colleges and one regional body, most of which did highlight significant governance failures. I don't want to dwell on the detail of them at all. The reports are available if you want to look at them, and I'm sure from your different bases in Scotland you'll have heard more or less about individual cases. It's also true that the issues captured in the reports were different in each case, and there's no single underlying theme which I can draw out for you. But I think they do serve as a very useful and timely reminder of the importance of good governance, both for individual colleges and for the wider sector as a whole. The Funding Council, as the main funder of the sector, does undertake regular monitoring and regular engagement with colleges, and I know has invested in developing that quite significantly over the last couple of years. That's led to real improvements in relationships and in information sharing, but it's interesting that it hasn't always been able to lead to an early identification and particularly resolution of problems where they have occurred. We also found that in spite of the many changes in the sector that all of us this morning have referred to, the government hadn't undertaken a comprehensive review of the role of the Funding Council against the backdrop of all of those changes. And I therefore recommended that the government should include the Funding Council in its end-to-end review of the skills and enterprise agencies to re-examine, clarify and make sure that the role of the Funding Council is really able to respond to the expectations that are placed on it, implicitly or explicitly. And we're looking forward to seeing what comes out of that when the review is published today and with the future phases to come. To conclude then, you're all operating in a challenging and rapidly changing environment, which really is likely to continue to present significant challenges to you, delivering services that could hardly be more important in today's Scotland. The sector has done well, as I said, to continue to exceed its learning targets and to maintain relatively sound finances, but managing the continuing impact of reform alongside further change and financial pressures will be complex and demanding. So for you as college board members, I think your role more than ever as an essential source of scrutiny and challenge, support for your teams, has never been more important. Board members are key to making sure that college strategies and plans are robust and properly tested, and that early action is identified and taken when those plans don't survive contact with reality, as they very often don't. As well as providing robust scrutiny, you also need to demonstrate strong leadership and continue to contribute to difficult decisions about priorities in a world of growing demand and very tight finances. We all know that accountability and scrutiny can come under pressure when bodies are under pressure themselves to meet tight financial targets, tight service delivery targets, and to be balancing multiple demands from your stakeholders. But when things do go wrong, it has a real impact, I think, on the individual college, the institution, its financial health and its reputation, the confidence in which it's held by students, staff, local communities, and on the sector as a whole. We were very pleased to see the outcome of the Good Governance Review. We've said that we think that will minimise the risk of lapses like that in future. But college board members really do have a key role in providing that challenge and support to make sure that colleges can deliver what's expected of them, and beyond that, that they can really make a contribution to the learning and delivery that will make Scotland's economy as successful as it can be, and also contribute towards the potential of individuals right across Scotland being achieved in future. We'll continue to watch what you're doing with interest, and I hope with support as well as challenge, and I wish you all good luck in taking it forward. Thanks very much.